Two corrupt cops humiliated a black woman outside the courthouse. What they didn't know was that she was the director of the FBI. And what happened next shocked everyone. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, stretching long shadows across the courthouse steps. The stone pillars, cold and towering, bore witness to countless trials, countless injustices, countless people walking in with hope and walking out with their futures stolen. But today, something different was happening. Something cruel. Something calculated. Two uniformed officers stood before a woman, a black woman, blocking her path, smirking, towering over her like predators savoring their prey. Around them, people walked past, some slowing down, others pretending not to see. The weight of unspoken complicity filled the air. One officer, the taller of the two, crossed his arms and let out a slow, mocking whistle. "Damn. I almost didn't recognize you without those big words and fancy courtroom attitude. But now you just look like another nobody." His partner chuckled, shaking his head. "You really thought you could step into our world, sit in that courtroom, run your mouth, and just walk out of here like you're one of us?" The second officer's voice dripped with condescension. "You should have kept your head down. Should have known your place." The woman said nothing. Her face remained unreadable, her expression controlled, though anyone watching closely would have noticed the way her fingers curled into fists at her sides. The first cop stepped closer, lowering his voice to a venomous whisper. "I saw the way you looked at us in there. Like you actually thought you had power. Like you thought we were afraid of you. Let me tell you something." He leaned in, his breath hot against her skin. "We don't fear people like you. We own people like you." The second cop snorted, nudging his partner with a smirk. She must be real quiet now, 'cause she finally realized it. Ain't that right? He turned his gaze back to her. "Or maybe you're just waiting for one of these fine folks to step in and save you. Guess what? Ain't nobody coming." He gestured toward the pedestrians walking past. "See that? Nobody cares. Nobody's gonna stop us. 'Cause at the end of the day, people like you get put back in your place. You can sit in that courtroom all you want, but out here, we make the rules." The first officer grinned. "Matter of fact, let's see how that attitude holds up when you're flat on your ass." He stepped forward abruptly, shoulder-checking her hard enough to make her stumble back against the stone railing of the courthouse steps. A few people turned to look. None spoke. None intervened. She caught herself, straightened her posture, dusted off her sleeves with slow, deliberate movements. And then, she smiled. Not the kind of smile they expected. Not nervous. Not afraid. Not broken. It was small. Controlled. The kind of smile that slithered under your skin, that whispered something wasn't quite right. The kind of smile that made even the most arrogant men hesitate. The officer's smirks faltered just slightly. "You think something's funny," the first cop snapped, narrowing his eyes. She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, composed, dangerously measured. "No. I just think it's interesting how comfortable you are right now." The second officer scoffed. "What the hell does that mean?" She took a step forward, not aggressive, not desperate, just close enough for them to feel a shift in the air. "It means you should have done your homework before opening your mouth." Something in her tone made the first officer hesitate for a fraction of a second before regaining his composure. He laughed. "Lady, I don't know what kind of fantasy you're living in, but out here, we call the shots. Not you." She didn't blink. "Is that so?" The second officer, sensing something was off but not quite grasping what, squared his shoulders. "Damn right." Silence stretched between them. A silence thick enough to suffocate. And then, just as the first officer opened his mouth to say something else, a phone rang. Not just any phone. His phone. He frowned, reaching for his belt, glancing at the screen. His partner's phone buzzed at the same time. Both officers exchanged looks. Unknown number. A single text appeared. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Their brows furrowed. The first officer shot a suspicious glare at the woman, but she remained still, unreadable. He answered the call. "This is Officer Travis," a voice cut him off. A voice calm. Steady. Professional. "Officer Travis, you and Officer Jenkins are hereby ordered to remain exactly where you are. Do not attempt to move. Do not attempt to leave. Do not attempt to make contact with the woman in front of you. A team is en route to take you into custody." Travis' breath hitched. Who the hell is this? The voice remained unfazed. "You'll find out soon enough." His heartbeat thundered against his ribs. His eyes darted around. This had to be a joke. A prank. And then, suddenly, the street was no longer just a street. The pedestrians were no longer just pedestrians. Eyes were watching. Cars that seemed parked at random had tinted windows rolled down just enough to reveal dark suits and earpieces. A black SUV idled nearby, its driver staring straight at them. His throat tightened. Jenkins' phone buzzed again. He looked down. A second text. "We know everything." His breath hitched. This is a joke, right?" He looked at his partner, but Travis wasn't laughing anymore. His face had drained of all color. The woman in front of them remained perfectly still. Perfectly composed. Perfectly in control. And then, in a single, deliberate movement, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a badge. Not a police badge. Not a lawyer's ID. Not some random security clearance. An FBI badge. And not just any FBI badge. A director's badge. Every drop of blood drained from their faces. Their stomachs plummeted. Their legs felt like they would give out beneath them. She stepped forward one last time, lowering her voice just enough for only the two of them to hear. "You wanted to teach me a lesson?" she whispered, her words razor-sharp. "Let me teach you one instead." The sound of tires screeching against pavement filled the air. Black SUVs, unmarked police cars, a wave of federal agents closing in. People who had just moments ago ignored the scene now watched with wide eyes as the two officers were surrounded. Everything they had built, the power, the control, the unchecked arrogance, was about to be ripped away. And they finally understood the truth. They hadn't just picked the wrong person to humiliate. They had picked the worst possible person. But the real question was, what was about to happen to them next? At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in all forms. This story is not just about a shocking twist, it's about accountability, resilience, and justice. To every black viewer watching this, know that your voice matters, your power is real, and your presence is undeniable. You are seen. You are heard. You are valued. Now, get ready for an intense and powerful story that will leave you speechless. And if you enjoy stories with twists that expose the truth, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Let's begin. The city of Baltimore was a place of contradictions, vibrant and rich in culture, yet weighed down by the invisible chains of systemic corruption. The streets, lined with old brownstone buildings, carried the whispers of history, while the skyline in the distance stood as a reminder of the power that few controlled. On the surface, it was just another American city, but beneath that surface, a war was being fought every day. A war between truth and deception. Between justice and the unchecked power of those who had forgotten what their badges were meant to stand for. Aisha Carter had seen it all. Born and raised in the very streets that many law enforcement officers considered problematic, she had spent her entire life fighting against the very system that claimed to serve and protect but, in reality, did neither for people who looked like her. She had worked twice as hard for half the recognition, learned to keep her head down while making her way up, and trained herself to never show weakness. Weakness got you eaten alive. Weakness made you a target. Her mother, a schoolteacher, had always told her, "Baby, you gotta be twice as good to get half as much, but don't you ever let them tell you that you ain't enough." Those words had carried her through the sleepless nights of law school, through the relentless battles of federal training, through the long days of fighting for justice in a world that seemed determined to silence voices like hers. Now, she was one of the most powerful women in the country, the director of the FBI. But power didn't mean safety. It didn't mean immunity from the disease that had infected the system for generations. And it certainly didn't mean respect. Respect, for women like her, was something that had to be demanded. The case that had brought her back to Baltimore was one that had haunted her for months. A web of corruption that stretched deep into the city's police department, reaching officers who had worn their badges like a license to do whatever they pleased. A case that had led her to uncover a connection between the police force and organized crime, proving what the people of Baltimore had long suspected: many of those meant to uphold the law were the ones breaking it. Two names kept surfacing in every report, every testimony, every thread she pulled. Officer Travis Cole. Officer Daniel Jenkins. Two officers with extensive records that had somehow remained untouched despite the complaints, the accusations, the brutality cases that had been swept under the rug. Officers who had terrorized the streets they were meant to protect, treating black and brown neighborhoods as hunting grounds, shaking down small-time dealers for profit, intimidating witnesses, planting evidence when necessary, ensuring that no one, not the department, not the city, would dare come for them. Until now. The case against them had finally made it to court. It was supposed to be a straightforward trial, evidence stacked high, testimonies airtight. But Baltimore's courts had a habit of bending for men like Cole and Jenkins. And as Aisha had expected, the trial ended not with a conviction, but with another slap on the wrist. A technicality. A loophole. A quiet assurance that the system was still on their side. Aisha had watched from the back of the courtroom, her jaw locked, her hands clenched into fists beneath the table. It wasn't the first time she had seen justice slip through the cracks, but that didn't make it any easier. She had spent her entire career believing in the law. But what do you do when the law refuses to believe in you? As the judge banged his gavel and dismissed the case, the officers had turned toward her, their smirks making it clear that they knew exactly what this was. A game they had just won. Cole, the taller of the two, with sharp features and eyes that had long since stopped seeing people as human, had given her a mocking nod. "Better luck next time, sweetheart." Jenkins, slightly shorter but just as dangerous, had grinned. "Guess we'll be seeing you around." And just like that, they had walked free. The courthouse steps had been crowded that afternoon, filled with reporters, activists, families who had been waiting for justice only to be met with disappointment yet again. The air had been heavy with anger, with exhaustion, with the all-too-familiar pain of watching injustice win once more. But the moment that changed everything, the moment that would set in motion a reckoning neither of them saw coming, happened just outside those doors. Aisha had barely stepped out onto the steps before she felt their presence behind her. She had known it was coming. Cole and Jenkins had always operated on intimidation. It was their favorite weapon, making people feel powerless, helpless, beneath them. They had done it to countless civilians. They had done it to fellow officers who dared to question them. And now, they thought they could do it to her. Cole's voice had been the first to break through the noise of the street. "Look at that, boys. The big-shot lawyer lady isn't looking so big now, is she?" Jenkins had laughed, shaking his head. "Nah, she looks real small now. Guess that's what happens when reality smacks you in the face." Aisha had stopped walking. The crowd around them had continued to move, some slowing down, some choosing to ignore. That was how it always was, wasn't it? People saw. People knew. But fear kept people silent. Cole had stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You thought you could take us down? He had leaned in just enough for her to feel the smugness rolling off of him. You should have known better. Jenkins had crossed his arms. A woman like you? Thinking she could walk into our world and actually win? He had scoffed. That's cute. Aisha had remained still. Cole had smiled. But let me give you some free advice, sweetheart. You don't belong here. You don't belong anywhere near this game. You might wear a fancy suit, might talk like you matter, but at the end of the day. His eyes had darkened. You're still just another nobody. Jenkins had nodded. And nobody's like you. They always lose. They had expected her to break. They had expected her to lower her gaze, to shrink beneath their words, to accept the lesson they were trying to teach her. But instead, she had done something that made them hesitate. She had smiled. Not the kind of smile that came from amusement, but the kind that made your stomach drop before your brain even understood why. The kind of smile that whispered, you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Cole's smirk had faltered. Jenkins' jaw had tightened. For the first time, they felt it, the shift in power. They had spent years believing they were untouchable. But they were about to learn something new. Because the woman standing before them wasn't just another lawyer. She wasn't just another activist, another name on a long list of people they thought they could silence. She was Aisha Carter, the director of the FBI. And by the time the sun set that day, their world would never be the same again. The city was restless that night. A heavy storm rolled in from the harbor, dark clouds hanging low over Baltimore's skyline, as if the sky itself was suffocating under the weight of everything that had gone unchecked for too long. The streets glistened under the dim glow of streetlights, reflecting a city that had mastered the art of looking away. But for Aisha Carter, tonight wasn't about looking away. Tonight was about making them see. Inside her office, the air was thick with something electric, an unspoken tension, the kind that only existed when something irreversible was about to happen. The walls, lined with case files and monitors filled with evidence, bore witness to the hours she had poured into this moment. This wasn't about anger. Anger was fleeting. This was about justice. About ensuring that men like Cole and Jenkins never got to walk away again. She leaned forward, fingers steepled as she studied the live feeds in front of her. Surveillance footage. Phone records. Bank transactions. Everything they thought had been buried was now staring back at her, screaming for action. A knock on the door broke the silence. Director Carter, a deep voice said as the door cracked open. We have them under full surveillance. They're exactly where we expected them to be. Agent Marcus Reed stepped inside, his expression unreadable but his posture tense. He had been with the Bureau long enough to recognize when a storm was coming, and right now, it was hanging in Aisha's eyes. She exhaled slowly, tapping her fingers against the desk. Let me guess. Drinking off their victory. Marcus nodded. Southside Bar. Their usual spot. Got a couple of off-duty officers with them, but nothing we can't handle. They're laughing. Drinking like they didn't just walk out of a courtroom they had no business winning. Like they're invincible. A muscle tightened in Aisha's jaw. They won't be for long. Marcus hesitated before speaking again. Are you sure you want to do this tonight? We could, she cut him off. You know what they did, Marcus. You know how many people suffered because of them. How many families were torn apart. How many cases they manipulated, how many kids they locked away to fill quotas. How many people they buried in a system designed to protect them. Her voice was measured, but there was no mistaking the fire underneath. Tell me, if we wait, do you think they'll wake up tomorrow morning and suddenly grow a conscience? Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew the answer. Aisha stood, smoothing out the fabric of her blazer. This isn't just about them anymore. This is about what happens if we let them think they won. She grabbed her coat. And I don't play losing games. The streets were alive with a kind of energy that came before something explosive. Aisha could feel it in her bones as she stepped out into the night, a silent storm of her own brewing inside her. Inside the bar, Cole and Jenkins were exactly as expected, loud, arrogant, relishing in their latest escape from justice. A bottle of whiskey sat between them, half empty, while Jenkins laughed over something Cole had said, clapping his partner on the back like they were untouchable gods in a world that refused to hold them accountable. You should have seen her face, Cole mused, swirling his drink. Thought she was gonna explode right there on those courthouse steps. Jenkins smirked. I still can't believe she thought she could take us down. Imagine thinking you actually have power in this world when you don't make the rules. Cole chuckled. They never learn. They keep thinking if they just work hard enough, if they play by the book, they'll get ahead. But the book was never written for them. And the people in charge? They look out for us. Jenkins leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. Still, we should keep an eye on her. She's got that look. The kind that doesn't let things go. Cole waved him off. What's she gonna do? Try to bring us down again. We own this city, Danny. People like her. He took another sip, smirking. They don't win against people like us. Jenkins nodded slowly, but something in his eyes darkened. Yeah. Until the day they do. Neither of them noticed the man sitting at the far end of the bar, listening carefully. A man who had been watching them since the moment they walked in. A man who, at this very moment, was sending a discreet message on his phone. Outside, Aisha was waiting. She leaned against a sleek black SUV, watching as the texts came in. They're exactly where we thought. No sign of suspicion. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she let the moment settle, let herself feel the weight of what was coming. Because after tonight, nothing would ever be the same for Cole and Jenkins. And they had no idea. She turned to Marcus, who was standing beside her, hands in his pockets, tension lining his frame. Are the warrants secured? He nodded. Signed, sealed, and waiting for execution. She exhaled slowly, feeling the full force of years of frustration, anger, and unspoken battles pressing against her ribs. Then let's make history. The door to the bar swung open. A figure stepped out, a younger officer, someone Aisha recognized as one of the less corrupt ones. He hesitated when he saw her, his face tightening as he debated whether to acknowledge her or keep walking. She didn't let him make the choice. Officer Decker. He stopped mid-step, his body stiffening. She pushed off the SUV and stepped closer, her voice measured. Tell me. Do you like being owned? Decker's jaw clenched. I don't know what you're talking about. She tilted her head. Don't you? You're drinking with them. Laughing with them. That makes you complicit, whether you like it or not. His eyes flickered toward the bar, then back to her. A war played out behind them. She didn't break eye contact. People like Cole and Jenkins. They're not untouchable. They just make people think they are. But the truth? The truth is, people like them only get away with it as long as we let them. Silence stretched between them, thick with meaning. Then, without another word, Decker turned and walked away. Aisha watched him go before turning back to Marcus. It's time. Inside the bar, Cole laughed again, knocking back the rest of his drink. I swear, it's like these people actually believe the law works the same for everyone. Jenkins chuckled. Yeah. And when they realize it doesn't? Cole smirked. It's too late. Then, as if summoned by fate itself, his phone buzzed. A single text message. You should have done your homework. A moment later, Jenkins' phone buzzed too. The air in the bar shifted. Their smirks faded. Their muscles tensed. And for the first time since they had walked free, a cold wave of realization settled over them. They weren't alone. Something was happening. And whatever it was, they were at the center of it. The night outside had deepened, the storm having passed, leaving the city soaked and the streets gleaming under the cold glow of neon lights. The bar had emptied out except for a few stragglers, but at the center of it all, sitting in their usual corner booth, were Travis Cole and Daniel Jenkins, their moods shifting from arrogant amusement to something more unsettled. Their phones lay on the table between them, the texts they had just received still glowing on the screens. "You should have done your homework." The words sat there like a warning carved in stone, heavy with a weight they weren't used to carrying. For the first time in a long time, the certainty they had always relied on, the confidence that nothing could touch them, was flickering. Cole let out a dry laugh, though it lacked his usual bravado. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his recent calls. Nothing unusual. This some kind of joke? He tossed the phone onto the table, shaking his head. Someone's trying to mess with us. Jenkins wasn't so sure. His fingers tapped against his glass, his jaw tight. Yeah. Then why's my gut telling me something's off? He exhaled sharply. Think about it, Travis. Who the hell even has our personal numbers? Who would send us this? And why now? Cole shrugged. Could be some pissed-off civilian trying to scare us. But even as he said it, there was something in his voice that hinted at doubt. Jenkins leaned in slightly, his voice lower now, edged with something that could almost be called concern. Or it could be her. Cole scoffed, but it wasn't as dismissive as it should have been. Carter. Come on, man. She's just a lawyer. Jenkins shook his head. No. She's not just a lawyer. You saw her in court, didn't you? You saw the way she looked at us outside the courthouse. That wasn't someone who was just gonna let this go. Cole's smirk faltered. He reached for his drink, but his fingers curled around the glass a little too tightly. Then, the door to the bar swung open. The atmosphere shifted instantly. It wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, but it carried a weight that made the air thicker. A presence that demanded attention without saying a word. Aisha Carter stepped inside. She moved with a purpose, her gaze scanning the room, landing directly on them. She wasn't alone. Marcus Reed walked in beside her, his expression unreadable, his movements deliberate. And behind them, just subtle enough not to be obvious, were two other agents, their suits blending into the dimly lit bar, but their presence unmistakable to anyone who knew how to recognize authority when they saw it. Jenkins stiffened immediately. Cole shifted in his seat. Neither of them had expected this. Aisha walked forward, every step controlled, every movement calculated. She stopped just short of their table, letting the silence hang between them, suffocating, stretching just long enough for discomfort to settle into their bones. Then, finally, she spoke. You're in my seat. Cole blinked. What? Aisha motioned to the booth. You're sitting in my seat. Move. For a moment, they just stared at her. Then Jenkins let out a dry, humorless laugh. You serious? She didn't repeat herself. She didn't have to. Something in the way she stood, in the way her eyes locked onto them with an authority they couldn't ignore, made it clear she wasn't asking. For the first time, Travis Cole hesitated. His body language shifted, subtle, but noticeable. This wasn't a game to her. Jenkins narrowed his eyes, but there was something forced in his expression, something uncomfortable. What the hell do you think you're doing here, Carter? She took her time answering, finally sliding into the booth across from them, her presence filling the space. Marcus took the seat beside her, the two other agents standing just close enough to remind them they weren't alone. Aisha folded her hands on the table, tilting her head slightly as she studied them. I wanted to see the look on your faces when you realized what's about to happen. Cole frowned. The hell does that mean? She reached into her pocket, pulled out a single folded document, and placed it on the table. Jenkins' gaze flickered toward it. He didn't move. Aisha leaned in slightly. You've spent your entire careers thinking you were untouchable. That the rules didn't apply to you. That no matter what you did, no matter how many lives you ruined, you'd always be protected. She exhaled sharply, almost as if she were disappointed. And for a long time, you were right. She paused, letting that reality settle, watching the way the first flickers of uncertainty crossed their faces. Then, she pushed the document toward them. That, she said calmly, is your reality check. Jenkins hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached for the document, unfolding it. His eyes scanned the page, and as he read, the color began to drain from his face. Cole leaned over, glancing at the words. Then, everything in him locked up. The page was an official federal warrant. Signed. Approved. Against them. Charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, abuse of power, falsification of evidence, perjury, racketeering, and, the one that made his breath hitch, RICO violations. Jenkins' grip on the paper tightened. This is bullshit. Aisha tilted her head, amused. Is it? Cole's voice came out lower now, rougher. You think you can actually pin this on us? Aisha just smiled. I don't think. I know. She sat back, watching as the weight of the moment sank into them. Jenkins shook his head. You can't do this. You think a judge is gonna let this stick? We've got people on the inside. Aisha cut him off, her voice calm, deadly. Not anymore. See, that's the part where you should have done your homework. You spent so much time thinking you were above the law, you never considered what would happen when someone who actually enforces it decided to make you her problem. Cole clenched his jaw. This is revenge. Aisha raised an eyebrow. Revenge? No. This is justice. The kind you should have faced a long time ago. The kind that people like you never see because the system was designed to protect you. Her voice hardened. But guess what? I'm the system now. Jenkins' breath came in faster, his pulse thudding against his temples. We have people. We have connections. Aisha shrugged. Not anymore. We spent months cutting your legs out from under you. Every judge you thought had your back. Gone. Every officer who covered for you. Either flipped or under investigation. Every little backdoor deal you made. She smirked. Sealed shut. For the first time in their lives, Travis Cole and Daniel Jenkins understood what powerlessness felt like. And Aisha Carter? She was just getting started. She leaned forward one last time, lowering her voice to a whisper that sent ice down their spines. You should have walked away when you had the chance. Then, in a single motion, Marcus reached into his coat and snapped a pair of handcuffs onto Cole's wrist. Cole jolted, the reality hitting all at once. Wait, Jenkins tried to push back, but another agent grabbed him, forcing him up. No, wait, the weight of what was happening crashed over them. As the bar fell silent, every patron watching, Aisha Carter stood, looking down at the two men who had spent their whole lives thinking they were untouchable. And with the kind of satisfaction that years of injustice couldn't erase, she finally said, game over. The air inside the bar had turned thick, like the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of what had just happened. For the first time in their lives, Travis Cole and Daniel Jenkins were on the other side of the power they had wielded so recklessly. Their wrists, now bound in cold steel, ached as the realization of their downfall set in. The murmurs of the onlookers around them, patrons who had once turned a blind eye, bartenders who had tolerated their presence, fellow officers who had shared drinks with them, were now laced with something different. Not sympathy. Not concern. But satisfaction. Jenkins' breathing had turned erratic, his chest rising and falling too quickly. His hands twitched in the cuffs as he struggled, his body refusing to accept what his mind already knew. He turned to Cole, expecting to see the same blind confidence, but for the first time, Cole wasn't smirking. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't cocky. He was silent. Aisha Carter stood before them, composed, unwavering, and fully in control. Her eyes, dark and sharp, didn't hold anger anymore. That would have been too easy. Anger could be dismissed. But power? True, undeniable power. That was something that left a permanent mark. Jenkins' voice came first, rough, desperate. This is bullshit. You have no right to do this. His body jerked, but the agents holding him in place didn't so much as flinch. You can't, this isn't how this works. Aisha barely tilted her head. Isn't it? Her voice was even, measured, deadly in its calmness. Because from where I'm standing, this is exactly how it works. The difference? This time, the badge actually means something. Cole finally exhaled, long and slow, the reality washing over him. You're making a mistake, Carter. His voice was low, but it was different now. There was no certainty. No authority. It was a man grasping at the last threads of the power he had once taken for granted. Aisha let out a breath that could have almost passed for amusement. I've made a lot of mistakes in my career. But this? She shook her head, stepping closer, so close that the only thing between them was the truth. This is the best damn decision I've ever made. Cole clenched his jaw, eyes darting around, looking for something, anything, to hold on to. You don't know what you're doing. You don't get it. We have people in our corner. You think a warrant and some shiny cuffs change that? He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. You don't have the reach we do. And when they come for us, they'll come for you too. Aisha studied him for a moment, and then, she smiled. But not the way they were used to seeing. Not with amusement. Not with gloating. It was the kind of smile that came when you knew you had already won. Your people. She let the words hang in the air, watching as the tension between them tightened like a noose. Your people are either flipping as we speak or they're already in custody. She turned slightly to Marcus, who had been waiting patiently for his moment. Agent Reed, do me a favor, tell them about the early morning raids. Marcus stepped forward, his voice as sharp as a blade. 5 simultaneous arrests at 3:45 a.m. Another 3 at dawn. Evidence seizures. Asset freezes. The whole damn department is in shambles. And guess what? He cocked his head slightly, letting the moment sink in. We saved the best for last. Cole stilled. His jaw clenched so tight that the muscle ticked at the side of his face. Jenkins' breath hitched. That was the moment it hit them. The empire they had built on fear, intimidation, and corruption. It was gone. Burned to the ground before they even had the chance to fight back. Jenkins shook his head, his voice breaking slightly. No. No, no, no. This is a setup. You rigged this. We were careful. We covered everything. Aisha let out a quiet laugh, one that sent chills down their spines. No, Jenkins. You weren't careful. You were comfortable. She exhaled, shaking her head. You thought because people were afraid of you, they'd never come forward. You thought because the system always worked in your favor, it always would. But the problem with corruption? Her voice dipped just enough to make the space between them feel suffocating. It makes people sloppy. And sloppy men make easy targets. Jenkins turned to Cole, his panic now visible, tangible. Say something. You have connections. You know people. His voice was unraveling. Fix this. Cole's eyes flickered to Aisha, and for the first time, there was something foreign in them. Not arrogance. Not control. Fear. Aisha took another step closer, lowering her voice to a whisper that dripped like poison. Do you feel it yet? Cole's breath shuddered. That feeling in your chest. The tightness? The panic? The walls closing in? That's what it feels like when you lose everything. She tilted her head slightly. Familiar, isn't it? The way you made people feel every time you framed them, every time you threw them in a cell, every time you told them to remember their place. Jenkins' voice was barely above a whisper now. Please. Aisha inhaled slowly, deeply, letting the weight of the moment stretch. Then, finally, she straightened, exhaling like she was letting go of something heavy. No. Cole clenched his fists, his shoulders tightening like he was bracing himself for something. But what could he do? There was no escape now. No favors to call in. No strings left to pull. Marcus pressed his earpiece, nodding to someone outside. Then, the doors swung open again, this time, with more agents, more officers. The kind of officers who had been waiting for this moment for years. The kind who had never forgotten what they did to their own people. Jenkins let out something between a curse and a prayer. Cole's breathing grew heavier. Aisha stepped back, giving them one final, lingering look before nodding to her team. Take them. Jenkins fought it at first, panic fully taking over, but the moment the agents moved in, it was over. Cole's face remained stone cold, his body stiff as his arms were pulled behind his back. It wasn't just the loss of power. It was the loss of the illusion. The illusion that men like him were untouchable. That the system was always rigged in his favor. But tonight, the system had turned its back on him. As they were led through the bar, every eye in the room was on them. Not with fear, but with recognition. With understanding. With the realization that for once, justice had actually won. And as Aisha watched them disappear into the night, into the back of a waiting car, she exhaled slowly, feeling something inside her finally settle. It was over. No. It was just beginning. The hum of the city felt different that night. Baltimore was still Baltimore, its streets wet from the earlier storm, the neon glow of liquor stores and gas stations flickering across damp pavement, the low murmur of late-night conversations seeping through cracked windows. But something had shifted. The weight of years, of injustice layered upon injustice, had finally cracked under its own pressure. And for the first time in a long time, there was a reckoning. Aisha Carter stood near the edge of the precinct parking lot, her arms crossed as she watched Cole and Jenkins disappear into the system they had once controlled. The SUV carrying them rolled through the metal gates, flanked by two unmarked bureau cars, heading toward a destination neither of them had ever imagined for themselves. Federal custody. A place meant for the criminals they had spent years planting evidence against, manipulating, forcing into cages they never should have been in. Now, the bars would be closing on them. Marcus stood beside her, silent, his hands in his coat pockets. His jaw was still clenched, the adrenaline still there, but there was something else in his eyes. Satisfaction? Relief? Maybe both. He finally exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Did you see their faces? They still thought they could talk their way out of it. Aisha didn't take her eyes off the road where the car had vanished. Men like them always do. Marcus let out a short, dry chuckle. Jenkins looked like he was gonna pass out. Because for the first time in his life, Aisha murmured, he wasn't the one in control. Silence settled between them again, but it wasn't the heavy kind. It was the kind that spoke louder than words. Aisha finally turned toward Marcus, her voice quieter now, more measured. You ever think about what happens next? He frowned slightly. What do you mean? She glanced back toward the precinct, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I mean after the headlines fade. After the trials. After they get what's coming to them. Her gaze darkened slightly. You ever wonder if it's enough? Marcus exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Enough? He gave her a look, one that was almost knowing. For who? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she let the words sit between them, let them sink in. Because that was the real question, wasn't it? Was this justice? Or was it just another momentary win in a war that never really ended? She had spent her life chasing justice. Building cases, fighting battles that felt unwinnable, proving people like Cole and Jenkins weren't untouchable. And yet, standing here, watching them disappear into the legal system, she felt something creeping in at the edges of her mind. Would it change anything? Would another set of crooked cops rise to take their place? Would the same system that had protected them for so long twist itself into something that softened their punishment? Would the world move on, as it always did, leaving behind nothing but another headline in a cycle that never truly ended? Marcus sighed, as if he could hear the thoughts running through her mind. You're thinking too much again. Aisha gave him a look. It's my job to think too much. He smirked slightly. It's also your job to win. She let out a breath, shaking her head. Yeah, well, I don't feel like celebrating just yet. Marcus shifted, tilting his head. You should. You put away two of the worst. Do you know how many people wanted this to happen but never thought it would? Aisha knew. She had received the calls. The quiet, whispered thank yous from people who had been too afraid to speak out before. From families who had lost someone to men like Cole and Jenkins. From officers who had been suffocated under the weight of corruption but had never been able to push back. She had done what no one else had. And yet. She turned back toward the precinct, watching as officers moved in and out of the building, as if nothing had changed. Marcus followed her gaze. You thinking about the department? Aisha exhaled through her nose. It's still dirty. You know it. I know it. She crossed her arms. Taking out two bad cops doesn't fix decades of rot. Marcus nodded, his expression shifting. No, but it's a start. Aisha didn't answer right away. Instead, she finally turned to him, her voice quieter, lower. And what happens when the next Cole and Jenkins show up? When they learn from this, get smarter, cover their tracks better. She shook her head. We didn't destroy the disease, Marcus. We just cut out one tumor. He studied her for a moment before letting out a slow breath. So what? You're just gonna keep going until what? The whole damn system is rebuilt? Aisha's gaze hardened. Yes. Marcus let out a small, tired laugh. You ever get tired of carrying the whole world on your shoulders? Aisha's lips curved, but it wasn't really a smile. You ever get tired of pretending it's not worth carrying? The moment stretched, the weight of everything unspoken settling into both of them. Then, Marcus ran a hand down his face, shaking his head. You really don't stop, do you? Aisha finally let out a real breath, one that almost resembled amusement. I can't afford to. Marcus sighed, tilting his head slightly. So what now? Aisha glanced back at the precinct one last time before turning toward the street. Now. She adjusted her coat, stepping forward. We see who's next. And with that, she walked away, her silhouette disappearing into the glow of the city. Marcus stood there for a moment longer, watching her go, before exhaling and following after her. Because the truth was, she was right. The war wasn't over. Not even close. The night was thick with something unspoken, something unfinished. The victory was real, undeniable, but it wasn't clean. Aisha Carter sat in her office, the dim light of her desk lamp casting long shadows across stacks of files, case notes, and reports that felt never-ending. The walls, lined with images of officers, informants, suspects, victims, pieces of a puzzle that could never be fully completed, felt closer tonight. The echoes of everything she had seen, everything she had fought against, pressed in on her. Her fingers drummed lightly against the desk, her other hand curled around a glass of whiskey she had barely touched. She wasn't much of a drinker, but tonight, she needed something to quiet the noise. A soft knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. She didn't have to look up to know it was Marcus. He didn't wait for an invitation, stepping inside like he had done 100 times before. His tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, his expression caught somewhere between exhaustion and something else. He shut the door behind him, but he didn't say anything right away. Aisha exhaled, rubbing the bridge of her nose before finally looking at him. "You look like you've been thinking too much again." Marcus let out a short, dry laugh as he dropped into the chair across from her. "That makes two of us." A beat of silence stretched between them before he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's done, Aisha. We got them. Cole and Jenkins are in holding, charges are stacking up, and by morning, the whole country is gonna know what they really are. You won." Aisha swirled the liquid in her glass, her gaze distant. "Did I?" Marcus frowned. "You don't sound convinced." Aisha set the glass down without drinking from it. "Do you know how many cases I've worked in my life? How many times I've thought, this is it, this is the one that's gonna change things?" She leaned back in her chair, shaking her head. "And every time, I thought I was closing a door on corruption, on injustice. But the next day, another one opened right back up." Marcus exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. "So what, you think this was all for nothing?" Aisha's jaw tightened. "I think the rot runs deeper than we realize. I think for every Cole and Jenkins we take down, there's another two waiting to take their place. I think I'm tired of watching people like them walk into a courtroom knowing they should lose and walking out knowing they won't." Marcus shook his head, leaning back. "I get it, Aisha. I do. But we did something tonight. Something that doesn't happen every day. We took down two of the worst and proved that even the untouchable aren't really untouchable. That has to mean something." Aisha let out a slow breath. "It does. But it's not enough." Marcus studied her for a long moment. "So what is enough?" Aisha met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Burning it all down and starting over." Marcus let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You're talking about the entire system." Aisha's silence was its own kind of answer. Marcus sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You really think that's possible?" Aisha didn't blink. "I think it's the only thing that ever really was." A knock on the door interrupted them again, this time more urgent. The door cracked open, and a young agent, Agent Harris, stepped inside. Her eyes flickered between them, hesitation clear in her stance. "Director Carter, there's something you need to see." Aisha exchanged a look with Marcus before pushing back from her desk and standing. They followed Harris down the hallway, the glow of the monitors in the control room spilling out into the dimly lit space. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind that only came when something unexpected had just landed in their laps. Harris gestured toward one of the screens. "We just received this footage. Anonymous drop. We don't know who sent it, but," she hesitated. "You're gonna want to see it." Aisha stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she watched the screen flicker to life. And then she froze. It was security footage. Inside the department. The timestamp was from a week ago. The image was grainy, but clear enough. A room, an interrogation room, empty except for two figures. One of them was Cole. The other was Chief Monroe. Aisha's stomach tightened. Marcus muttered under his breath, "What the hell?" The footage played, the audio crackling with static before a conversation took shape. Cole leaned against the table, smirking. We got a problem, Chief. Monroe exhaled, shaking his head. You idiots are reckless. You think this department's gonna cover for you forever? Cole chuckled. You tell me, Monroe. You've been covering for us for years. Monroe's jaw clenched. This case you're tangled up in. It's getting too big. You need to lay low. Cole tilted his head. Lay low. You think Carter's just gonna forget about this? Monroe's silence was enough of an answer. Cole smirked. That's what I thought. So how about instead of telling me to lay low, you do what you always do and make sure none of this touches us? Monroe exhaled sharply, his fingers pressing against the bridge of his nose. I can't keep pulling strings for you. Cole leaned forward, voice lower now, more pointed. You don't have a choice. Monroe's eyes flickered toward the camera, toward the recording device that neither of them had known was running. And then, the footage cut out. Silence. Heavy. Dangerous. Aisha's breath came slow and controlled, but inside, something was breaking apart and rearranging itself into something even sharper than before. Marcus let out a curse under his breath. Monroe's dirty. Aisha already knew it. She turned to Harris, her voice deadly quiet. Where did this come from? Harris shook her head. Anonymous drop. But it came with a note. A warning. She reached into her pocket, unfolding a small slip of paper. You took down 2. But they were just the surface. Monroe is the beginning. Follow the trail. Aisha's fingers tightened around the paper. She had thought tonight was the end of something. She had been wrong. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The weight of the revelation settled like a thick fog in the room, pressing down on every breath, every heartbeat. Chief Monroe. The man who had sat across from Aisha in meetings, the man who had shaken hands with her after press conferences, the man who had publicly condemned corruption while privately ensuring it thrived beneath the surface, he had been pulling the strings all along. Aisha felt something tighten in her chest, something she refused to name, because it wasn't shock. It wasn't disbelief. It was confirmation. A part of her had always known that the rot ran deeper than Cole and Jenkins, but seeing it laid out so plainly, so undeniably, was something else entirely. Marcus let out a breath, his fingers pressing against the table as he stared at the dark screen where the footage had just played. You called it, Carter. We cut off one head, and now we're staring at the whole damn body. Aisha didn't respond right away. Her mind was moving too fast, connecting dots that had always been there but had never been quite this clear. Monroe had been protecting Cole and Jenkins, not just looking the other way, not just bending under pressure, but actively ensuring that they stayed untouchable. He had made sure their names never landed on the wrong desk, that their cases disappeared before they could go to trial, that their victims were silenced before their voices could be heard. And if Monroe was involved, that meant others were too. Aisha exhaled sharply, turning to Agent Harris. Who else has seen this footage? Harris hesitated. Just us. It was sent to my inbox directly. No name, no traceable source, just the note and the file. Aisha nodded, her jaw tight. Good. This doesn't leave this room until I say so. Marcus gave her a look. Carter, this is huge. If Monroe, Aisha cut him off, her voice razor-sharp. I know exactly what this is, Marcus. Which is why we can't rush it. If Monroe's dirty, he didn't do this alone. There are people in his pocket, people who have been keeping him protected for years. If we make the wrong move, if we tip him off before we have everything, he'll burn it all down before we can touch him. Marcus ran a hand over his face, his frustration evident, but he knew she was right. So what's the move? Aisha's eyes flickered back to the dark screen, the memory of Monroe's face frozen in time, his expression tense, his words laced with the kind of fear that only comes when someone knows their time is running out. She turned back to Harris. "We need to find out who sent this. Someone inside the department recorded that conversation, and they risked everything to get it to us. That means there's a crack in Monroe's armor, and whoever did this is trying to push it wide open." Harris nodded, her fingers already moving across her tablet. "I'll run a deeper trace, see if I can pull anything from the metadata." Aisha turned to Marcus. "I need you to go through every closed case Monroe ever touched. Every complaint, every officer who was mysteriously transferred or let go after filing a report against him. I want to know exactly how deep this goes." Marcus gave a short nod, pushing off the table. "On it." As Harris and Marcus moved, Aisha stood there for a moment longer, staring at the empty screen. The pieces were shifting. The game had changed. Cole and Jenkins had been pawns, dangerous, reckless pawns, but pawns nonetheless. Monroe was the real player. And she had just been handed the key to taking him down. She just had to make sure she didn't get caught in the fallout. The next morning, Baltimore felt different. Maybe it was just her. Maybe it was the weight of what she knew now, the knowledge that the city had been operating under the command of a man who had mastered the art of deception. Or maybe it was the way the officers in the precinct avoided her gaze just a little too much, the way some of them looked at her like they knew she knew. She moved through the station with purpose, her steps controlled, her face unreadable. She couldn't afford to show anything. Not yet. As she passed by the glass office where Monroe sat, his head bent over a file, his expression neutral, she felt a slow burn crawl through her chest. He had no idea. No idea that someone within his own walls had turned on him. No idea that his empire was cracking at the foundation. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Monroe glanced up, his face unreadable, but she saw the way his fingers stilled over the file in front of him. "Carter. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Aisha took her time, moving to the chair across from him, but she didn't sit. "Just checking in." Monroe leaned back, studying her. "That so?" She gave a slow nod. "We made a lot of noise last night. Thought I'd see how the department's holding up." Monroe let out a small, knowing chuckle. "I'd say people are processing it." His eyes held something beneath the surface, something cold, something calculating. "Not everyone agrees with how it went down." Aisha tilted her head slightly. "Good thing justice doesn't need their approval." Monroe let the silence stretch, the corners of his mouth curving up just slightly. "I suppose not." For a second, neither of them moved, neither of them blinked. It was a test, a game of restraint, a war fought in silence. Then, finally, Monroe exhaled, pushing back his chair. "Well, I appreciate the check-in, Director. But if you'll excuse me, I have a department to run." Aisha didn't move. "Of course. But one more thing." Monroe paused, his hand on the edge of his desk. She leaned forward just slightly, just enough to let her voice dip into something just shy of a threat. "You ever wonder what happens to men who think they're untouchable?" Monroe's jaw tensed. "Can't say I do." Aisha smiled. "They always find out the hard way." She turned, walking out before he could say anything else. But as she stepped back into the hallway, something in her gut twisted. Because when she glanced back through the glass, Monroe wasn't watching her leave. He was on his phone. And something told her that whatever he was about to do next was going to change everything. The storm had passed, but the aftershock remained. The weight of everything, the corruption, the betrayals, the quiet war fought in shadows, had left a mark on the city, whether people saw it or not. But Aisha Carter saw it. She felt it. She lived it. And tonight, after everything, it was finally over. Chief Monroe had tried to run. The moment he realized he was exposed, he did exactly what men like him always did, he made a deal with the devil, hoping to escape the flames. He had connections, people in high places, back channels that had saved him before. He thought he could outmaneuver them, thought he could slip away before the walls closed in. But Aisha had been 10 steps ahead. She had followed the money. The secret accounts, the offshore transfers, the quiet bribes passed in dimly lit back rooms, every move he had made to secure his power had left a trail. And when the hammer came down, it came down hard. Monroe wasn't just arrested. He was dismantled. The footage was released. The entire country watched as the chief of police, the man who had built his legacy on the lie of integrity, was dragged out of his office in handcuffs. The department tried to cover it up, tried to spin the narrative, but there was too much evidence, too much truth to bury. The dominoes fell one by one. Officers who had once stood by him suddenly turned against him, making deals to save themselves. The network of corruption that had held Baltimore in its grip for so long collapsed under its own weight. And Cole and Jenkins? They didn't walk away either. Their trial was fast-tracked. The evidence Aisha's team had gathered was airtight, undeniable, and when the verdict came down, it was guilty on all counts. RICO violations, conspiracy, obstruction, falsification of evidence, they weren't going to see freedom again. No power, no badge, no department to shield them. Cole had sat there, silent, his face drained of all the arrogance, all the control he had once flaunted. Jenkins had tried to fight it until the end, his voice raw as he cursed, as he swore it wasn't over. But it was. The system they had built to protect themselves had turned against them. And Aisha Carter? She stood at the center of it all, unshaken, unbroken, victorious. The news covered it for weeks. The headlines were everywhere. Police corruption ring exposed. Baltimore chief arrested in FBI sting. Once untouchable officers face life behind bars. But Aisha didn't bask in the spotlight. She didn't take victory laps. She knew better. Because while this battle was won, the war wasn't over. She sat in her office one last time, looking over the files stacked in front of her. There were always more cases, more names, more people who thought they could play the system and walk away untouched. She had brought down giants, but there would always be another. And she would always be ready. Marcus walked in, his tie loose, his expression carrying something between exhaustion and admiration. He shook his head, letting out a small, tired laugh. "You really did it." Aisha didn't look up. "We did it." Marcus sat across from her, studying her for a moment. "You ever gonna take a break?" Aisha finally lifted her gaze, the hint of a smirk playing at her lips. "You ever gonna stop asking me that?" Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. "Didn't think so." He leaned back, stretching his arms over his head. "So, what now?" Aisha glanced down at the new files on her desk. The next cases. The next names. The next battles. She didn't hesitate. Now. She exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle, letting herself feel the weight of what she had done, what she still had to do. Now we keep going. Because justice isn't just a one-time victory. It's a war fought every single day. Some people think power makes them invincible. That the system will always work in their favor. That their crimes, their corruption, their abuse of authority will never catch up to them. But the truth? The truth is, no one is untouchable. Not forever. And sometimes, the people they underestimate the most, are the ones who bring them down. What do you think? Should people like Monroe, Cole, and Jenkins get life in prison? Do you think corruption like this happens in more places than we know? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, let's talk about it. And if you love stories with justice, twists, and people getting exactly what they deserve, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist and hit that like button. Because trust me, there's always another story waiting to be told.